Hello, BookTube. Welcome back to another Middlemarch meditation. I thought I would include a map, as you can see, to open this video, and that's because the impression I'm left with, as we've now reached the second part of Chapter 5, is that the story of Middlemarch is going to expand beyond the narrow confines of Tipton, or we've mainly been in Tipton, haven't we? If we look at this map here, I don't have a pointer, so I'm going to have to try to use my sense of direction, and that has its flaws. But up in the top left-hand corner there, you can see Tipton just underneath the compass. So that is the Brooke residence. Directly next door to it is Freshitt. That is Sir James Chetham's residence. And just from looking at that, you can see perhaps why Mr. Brooke was so keen for Dorothea to marry Sir James Chetham, or why at least he questioned her quite closely about her refusal of Chetham and her acceptance of the Reverend Casaubon. Because you can see a distinct advantage, can't you, with these two adjoining properties. I believe back in Chapter 1, did it not say that whichever daughter bore a son first, either Dorothea or Celia, that son would become the inheritor of the Brooke property, and also whatever wealth belonged to Dorothy and Celia's late parents. And of course, if that daughter who bore the son was also married to Sir James Chetham, then you could see that the son she bore would become a sizable property owner. So there was a lot more going on in all the courtship arrangements here than just Dorothea's happiness, although anybody who's read Victorian literature, and I imagine most people viewing this video have, and you must know, you don't even need me to tell you, that these kind of marriages were never really arranged with the couple's happiness. I mean, in fact, if the couple did happen to like each other, that was a wonderful bonus. If we go to the other side of the map, to the top right, we will see Lowick, and we will see the Reverend Casaubon's mansion. It's quite a house. In fact, it looks to be, in this map anyway, the artist has decided it's a much larger house than Tipton, by the looks of it. Maybe even larger than Freshitt. It's interesting that a man who lives by himself has this huge... Anyway, but you can see it's very close to the church. And then, of course, there's also the rectory. I think that'd be the smaller house on the other side of the church. But that's not where the Reverend Casaubon lives. He lives in something that looks more baronial. And then there's the town of Middlemarch itself, which we've not actually yet spent any time in. But I just feel that this map is going to become more... Well, we might refer to it more. Let's see. So as mentioned, we are currently at the halfway point of Chapter 5. In fact, I'm going to put page 46 up here. We got to the halfway point of page 46. Let's see if I can move it up. Nope, it's not going to let me do that. Come on. There we go. To this halfway point, to the comment that I've highlighted, where Mr. Brooke is saying to Dorothea, okay, marry who you want to marry, but I'm afraid Chetham will be hurt and Mrs. Cadwallader will blame me. And we left at that point wondering, who's Mrs. Cadwallader? Those of us who have not read the book, right? If you're following along and you know Middlemarch like the back of your hand, you must be enjoying these videos. You must be enjoying me, having a guess at what is yet to come. Well, good. Enjoy that. That's absolutely fine. So we're going to carry on now. A question rose in my mind after I made the last video. If Dorothea's acceptance of Casaubon's proposal is going to cause Mr. Brooke all this inconvenience, which he says it is, then why was Casaubon invited to Tipton? Why was he brought along? Was he just supposed to occupy a chair at the dinner table, make Sir James Chetham look really good? I mean, he definitely wasn't invited for his scintillating company, or, as we'll see when Celia starts to remark, definitely not for his table manners either. So, okay, was he invited so that there would be mixed company without giving Sir James Chetham any competition? I could see somebody's thinking going along those lines. It makes sense. Mr. Brooke has already clearly demonstrated that he's got no grasp of Dorothea's intellectual capacity. He presumes no woman can be trusted to put his own papers in order or be expected to follow discussions on matters of science or politics. And so it follows that he would take a look at Casaubon and go, that's an old, scholarly, solitude-loving creature. There couldn't be less husband-like material. I'll invite him to dinner. He can sit in the chair because we have to have this strange man-woman dinner setting thing in Victorian times, another strange tradition. And so it'll look nice around the table, but there's no danger that Casaubon will get in there on the marriage market and then try to take one of the girls. It simply won't happen. It seemed to me that Eliot used the rest of this chapter to make it clear just how many people that live on this map that we've shown you, just how many of them would regard Casaubon as a non-marrying man. And therefore, just how utterly, well, it won't, even surprised won't even cover it. Let's get to that. Let's start with Cecilia, because the narrator has told us that Celia, I want to call her Cecilia, Celia is very observant of conventions, isn't she? That for her, conventions are the way things are, right? They're not somebody's inventions. What she does in these next scenes that we're going to look at, effectively what she does represents what all of Middlemarch society in its conventional mindset is also very likely to do. So let's look at that. That evening, of course, Celia knew nothing of what had happened. She attributed Dorothea's abstracted manner and the evidence of further crying since they had got home to the temper she had been in about Sir James Chetham and the buildings, and was careful not to give further offence. There's a lovely point about Celia. Having once said what she wanted to say, Celia had no disposition to recur to disagreeable subjects. I do find that a good point. I would never want anyone to think that I am all pro-Dorothea and anti-Celia, or pro-Celia and anti-Dorothea. They have their points. It says here, it had been Celia's nature when a child never to quarrel with anyone, only to observe with wonder that they quarrelled with her, and looked like turkey cocks. That's a reference again to, was it a comment on page 32? It's a description that Celia, she's less concerned about what people say, but it really does bother her how they say it, and particularly what they look like when they're saying it. So people that open their mouths and move their hands, they just distress her terribly, to the point where she will literally blank out what they're saying. And I suppose that's how she doesn't have a reaction then. So they can be carrying on at her, ranting and raving, waving their hands, and she will simply not take it in and therefore not be offended. And she says, whereupon she was ready to play at cat's cradle with them. Let's just pause there and let's talk about cat's cradle, because I had to look that up. Not because I've never seen cat's cradle. Let me just take the page off for a minute, and we'll just remove the map and show this lovely Victorian painting of two girls playing cat's cradle. Now, I can't remember what this was called when I was school age in Canada. It had a name, this thing. But I'm sure most of my viewers, if they're English, they call it cat's cradle. The thing, I've never liked cat's cradle myself. Let me just say that. I remember watching children playing it. I wasn't interested in playing it. It looked tremendously boring. Was that just me? Apologies to anyone if you played it for hours and hours with a friend. And I'm only Google educated about this game, right? So not an expert. But apparently it predates the 19th century, and the concept may have traveled back several centuries and come from Southeast Asia, because there are illustrations and paintings from Japan, I believe, and China showing much earlier representations of people playing what looks very much like cat's cradle. So, but the point, it describes how non-combative Celia is, because you can see cat's cradle, you couldn't play cat's cradle with someone you were not feeling good about, could you? You have to be very close to them. You have to get your hands very close to their hands, and I can imagine there's a lot of sort of, what's the word I'm thinking of, sympathetic movement. Both people have to work together to make the game work. So they have to really get on. It's a very intimate game. And I can understand that my close girlfriends, they know each other and get on very well, would play it. But it says something about Celia, that she's so devoid of the fault that most of us have. I'm no better. If somebody gets angry with me and I think it's unjust, I think I would find it difficult to just go, oh, never mind, let's just hang out together now. I might need a bit of time to just cool down. And then I could perhaps, enjoy some kind of pastime with that person that didn't involve too much interaction, because I might still be testing where we are as as people, how we're going to get on. So Celia, that she could not take quarrels to heart, and if she was prepared to just give herself to an activity with that person, even after they'd shown so much wild emotion and facial expressions, it does say something about her. But it got me thinking about this business of, assisting a young woman with needlework or knitting. Because in the 19th century, there is a lot of this. There's a lot of this in art, in visual art, but also in literature. And I think that there's some kind of metaphor that where you can use knitting, needlework, and the things related to it as metaphors for intimate connection. And I'm going to use an example. I'm going to use one of Eliot's other books. In fact, the only other book I have read. There you go. I've got a lot of Eliot to cover. Mill on the Floss. The Mill on the Floss was assigned reading when I went to university. So if you haven't read that novel, I'll give you a little recap. Eliot introduces toward the end of the book a character named Stephen Guest. And Guest he's a Sir James Chatham type, right? He's young, he's handsome, he's wealthy. He is the perfect marriage partner by Victorian middle-class conventional standards, yes? He's courting Lucy Dean. Now, Lucy, of course, is a little Celia-like. Yes. I don't think it's wrong to compare the two women. I'm not saying they're identical twins, but I am saying that there's a certain sort of innocent accepting of convention, not taking offense easily, not tending to have suspicions or an overactive imagination that goes places you don't really want it to. So Stephen is courting Lucy, and Eliot introduces the couple sitting together in Lucy's drawing room. Lucy is working on her embroidery, and Stephen is holding her little pair of scissors, very pretty pair of scissors. Now, when she needs those scissors, Stephen suggests that, he can't get them off his fingers, which is just a little contrivance, of course, because it makes Lucy, she has to touch his hands to take it off. There's really no other way. And then he kind of touches her fingertips back, and there's a little moment between them. So it says that the scissors are drawn off with gentle touches from tiny tips, which naturally dispose Mr. Stephen for a repetition da capo, meaning from the beginning. In other words, the pleasure of having Lucy draw the scissors off his fingers is such that he thinks, I've got to find a way to make that happen again. So while it seems a really affectionate game, there is something else going on in that scene, because scissors are the dominant motif. In other words, something that cuts a connection, cuts a thread, rather than joins anything with a thread. So bear that in mind. Following on from that scene, Stephen Guest will meet Lucy's cousin, Maggie Tulliver. The meeting will unsettle both of them deeply. They will feel a kind of attraction they have never felt before for another person. Lucy, because she's so sweet and innocent, will be oblivious. And that's partly too because Stephen and Maggie will strive to act as though they are not affected by each other in any way. And during this first meeting, Maggie will volunteer to help Lucy. She wants to offer to knit some items for a local bazaar. Now Lucy's delighted, and she says to Maggie, I shall set you to work with scarlet wool tomorrow. Very important color. A color, I believe scarlet thread has a biblical connotation. I think it represents the blood of Christ as something connecting the believer to their source of salvation. But I think there's also a romantic metaphor. I think there's also a metaphor whereby a scarlet thread connects you with the person you are destined to be with. So Maggie is given this scarlet wool to work with. And then there's a very loaded scene much later on. Stephen accidentally meets Maggie when she is on her own. and the business of concealing their mutual feelings becomes much, much more difficult. At one point in this scene, Maggie drops her ball of wool and it rolls along the floor. And Stephen picks it up, but he's actually afraid to hand that ball of wool over to Maggie because he's afraid that when she reaches out to get it, there might be a connection of fingers. And that's interesting. So he not only does he know, whereas when he had the scissors, he wanted to repeat the connection with Lucy. When he has the ball of wool, he wants to avoid connection. And the text actually said he dared not put out his hand. He thrust both hands into his tail pockets as he spoke. Now that's a bit of a digression, but if we take this idea of threads and yarn as symbols of connection, then Celia's willingness to play the game of cat's cradle, even with people who've quarreled with her, shows a willingness to maintain personal connections. And I'm hoping that says something positive about Celia, because I'm sure that what's coming up for her is not going to be fun. Not going to be fun at all. Let's go on now to page 47. And what I'm hoping you'll watch out for, I've done a lot of marking up on this page. I don't know that you should necessarily pay attention to too much of it. Some of it's speculative, especially about Celia's bedtime there. I wrote that down and then I thought, I don't know if I'm taking myself seriously on that one, but I'll leave you to decide. I'll leave you to decide. What I've marked here, if you see anything marked in green, I'm looking for biblical imagery because I seem to find quite a lot of it in this section. And if you see anything marked in blue, it's words that relate to extremes. And if I've used red with the blue, it's because they are emotional extremes as opposed to some other variety. So let's go up to the top of the page. Celia has noticed that Dorothea is different. Is very different. She's noticed, for example, that even though the two of them are in that lovely little sitting room that they have, which is just off their separate bedrooms, Dorothea normally has something to do in the evenings, but now she's seated on a low stool and she's unable to occupy herself except in meditation. And then she says something which has a musical intonation, which is very unlike Dorothea. She says, "Celia, dear, come and kiss me," holding her arms open as she spoke. Now that was that made me uncomfortable. I'm not Celia. Celia's probably too lovely to feel uncomfortable, but I immediately, pulled back and thought, what's all that about? It was very lovey, and it had insincerity in it or something. And immediately I thought of a Judas kiss, because Dorothy is still keeping a secret, and it's quite a big secret, So the kiss disturbed me a little bit, and it reminded me of the moment that Judas betrayed Jesus to I think it was the troops belonging to the high priest before he was arrested. So that Celia got down to the right level and gave her little butterfly kiss. That's a lovely word. Beautiful little bit of imagery, because you can just imagine a kiss that barely, like the feet of a butterfly. Just there. While Dorothea encircled her with gentle arms and pressed her lips gravely on each cheek in turn, which again made me think of Judas, although I don't believe Judas kissed Jesus on both cheeks, just on the one. That was enough. Celia then says, "Don't sit up, Dodo. You are so pale tonight. Go to bed soon," said Celia, and she said it in a comfortable way without any touch of pathos. So in other words, Celia wasn't tempted to do what Dorothea had done, which is just, overact. It's the best way to put it. And Dorothea says, "No, dear, I am very, very happy." And she says that fervently. There's just a little bit too much. It's like Dorothea's a bit high. If it weren't a 19th century novel, I'd suspect that there was, a substance involved that was making her so very strange. Celia replies, "So much the better." Or no, she doesn't reply. She's thinking. This is her thinking. So she's thinking, well, so much the better that Dorothy is happy. But then in blue I've said, but how strangely Dodo goes from one extreme to the other. Yeah, she does. And that is very, very odd. So we'll move down the page here, because it's the next day. The next day at luncheon, the butler. I'm not sure why I underlined the butler in blue, because that's not an extreme. Handing something to Mr. Brooks, said, "Jonas is come back, sir." So I think I was just noting how many servants there were in the house before I decided that blue stood for extremes. There's nothing extreme about having a butler. And Jonas is not an extreme name. Although I did think again of Jonah and the whale. I thought Jonah's come back. In other words, boy, I tell you what, we're getting into a Sunday school lesson. I never meant that, but I know the Old Testament fairly well. The prophet Jonah was dispatched to go to Nineveh and send a prophetic message and come back. And so anyway, the fact that this servant is called Jonas, I just thought, I wonder. And anyway, Jonas has come back and he's brought this letter. Mr. Brooke read the letter and then, nodding toward Dorothea, said, "Casaubon, my dear, he will be here to dinner. He didn't wait to write more." Didn't wait, you know. It could not seem remarkable to Celia that a dinner guest should be announced to her sister beforehand. But her eyes following the same direction as her uncle, she was struck with the peculiar effect of the announcement on Dorothea. It seemed as if something like the reflection of a white sunlit wing. And I stopped again because I did like that imagery as well, as if an angel had flown past your face, and that special light that only an angel's wing could possibly, had passed across her features, that is Dorothea's features, ending in one of her rare blushes. Yes, Dorothea doesn't often blush. For the first time, this must be a terrible moment, for the first time it entered into Celia's mind that there might be something more between Mr. Casaubon and her sister than his delight in bookish talk and her delight in listening. Wow, now we learn that Celia never for a moment suspected. Hitherto, she had classed the admiration for this ugly and learned, there we go. Now I've underlined that because I thought, does Celia think those two things always go together? Or does she just think those two things are the extreme of unattractive? So he's ugly and learned. So hitherto she'd classed the admiration for this ugly and learned acquaintance with the admiration for Monsieur Liret at Lausanne. This was the school that Celia and Dorothea went to in Switzerland. And apparently this man was also ugly and learned. So Celia just thought, I know Dorothea. She's got a thing about learned men who are old and ugly, and so she just found another one. She's come back from Switzerland and she's found another learned old ugly man. And it just says Dorothea had never been tired of listening to old Monsieur Liret when Celia's feet were as cold as possible, and when it really became dreadful to see the skin of his bald head moving about. Celia, talking about convention, it's not just that she's got a sharp observation for convention. She obviously also is very particular about physical details, very particular about what she does and does not find attractive physically. She notices very small things. She's actually quite sensitive. So she didn't like his bald head moving about. Why then should, that is hers, that is Dorothea's enthusiasm, not extend to Mr. Casaubon simply in the same way? So there we go. I'm going to remove my logo here just because it's getting in the way of the page. There we go. And it seemed probable that all learned men had a sort of schoolmaster's view of young people. Yes, very probably, Celia. But now Celia was really startled at the suspicion which had darted into her mind. This must be a scary, scary moment, because it says she was seldom taken by surprise in this way. This was not, hyper-observant, noticing tiny, tiny details of people's physical appearance. That's Celia. So go to the top of page 48 and stretch that out. Her marvelous quickness in observing, this wasn't very well photographed, a certain order of signs, generally preparing her to expect such outward events as she had an interest in. Now, maybe that's the problem, right? When Celia doesn't have an interest, her powers of observation switch off. And maybe that's where we could say she has a failing, that she's very observant up to a point. And when she reaches that point, she becomes utterly dull. It seems to be the point at which Dorothea's intellect takes over, and that's when Dorothea is sharply observant. So they complement each other so perfectly. Celia covers off all those things that almost aren't intellectual, and then Dorothea picks up right where Celia leaves off. But the problem is that leaves both of them with a blind spot, of course. Not that she now imagined Mr. Casaubon to be already an accepted lover. That's probably a step too far, isn't it? It's frankly, it's a step too far for me, but, I'm going with this story. She had only begun to feel, oh, here we go, here come the ugly feelings. Disgust. Disgust. And I don't blame her. We have always had, let me just take the page away and also change this illustration for this one. In Western society, we've always had a social uneasiness. Even though we've sometimes allowed it to happen, we've always had a social uneasiness, given that historically men have usually been the ones who chose who they married, and women could only acquiesce to what they were offered. They couldn't usually go out and pick. You ended up with where there were unequal marriages, and that's the title of this painting, The Unequal Marriage. Where there were unequal marriages, it was normally an older man taking advantage of the fact that he could choose a much younger woman. And so let's go back to page, what were we on now? I've already lost track. Page 47, was that right? Let's just do that. Nope, it was page 48. That Celia feels disgust at the possibility that anything in Dorothea's mind could tend towards such an issue. Here was something to really vex her about Dorothea. Now, we thought that she already was vexed on a number of occasions. This has obviously gone to another level. It was all very well not to accept Sir James Chetham, but the idea of marrying Mr. Casaubon, Celia felt a sort of shame. Yeah, again, mingled with the sense of the ludicrous. So there's all these really... But perhaps, Dodo, if she were really bordering on such an extravagance, that's an interesting word. Only in the 90s, we would use some other word now, I think, and I don't know what it would be, but it would be... extravagance has a sense of luxury, and I'm not sure if it's a luxury in this case. So Celia is still holding on to the hope that maybe that Dorothea might be turned away from it. And then it goes on to say the circumstances, that the day was damp and they weren't going to walk out, so they both went up to that little sitting room. And there Celia observed that Dorothea, this is a lovely passage, instead of settling down with her usual diligent interest to some occupation, simply leaned her elbow on an open book and looked out the window at the great cedar silvered with the damp. And I put green around cedar because I kept thinking of cedars of Lebanon. But I also thought that to some degree there is a pseudo-phallic symbol there, the staring out at the great tree. But cedars, of course, are a symbol of connection, spiritual connection. So there's something there. The two things are tied together, I think, because Dorothea has almost confused her erotic desire with her desire for a level of religious ecstasy, I would say. And the two things can very much interchange. So, which Dorothea probably doesn't know, because she's still too young to know that those two things can actually be substituted one for the other, if that makes any sense. Dorothea was, in fact, thinking that it was desirable for Celia to know. Yeah, maybe. But you can tell that even Dorothea thinks, is it desirable? Because further down this paragraph it said, but it was impossible not to shrink from telling her. There begins this weird little discussion, which Celia starts out in her usual way when she wants to get a discussion going toward a topic. She approaches it in a very indirect way, and I haven't done a translation of this conversation. I could do it some other time, perhaps, where she says to Dorothea, is anyone else coming to dine besides Mr. Casaubon? Innocent-sounding question. Dorothea says, not that I know of. And then Celia, let's try a little poke. I hope there is someone else. Then I shall not hear him eat his soup so. Dorothea, ooh, yeah, properly provoked. What is there remarkable about his soup eating? Really, Dodo, can't you hear how he scrapes his spoon? And he always blinks before he speaks. The thing she notices. I don't know whether Locke blinked. Of course, because we know that Casaubon, we're supposed to look to a picture of John Locke for our idea of what Casaubon looks like. I did that in an earlier meditation, but feel free to look him up on Google, because he's also not what I'd call a prize-winning physical specimen. I think, you would value Locke for his mind. So anyway, I don't know whether Locke blinked, but I'm sure I am sorry for those who sat opposite him if he did. Okay, well, this is just starting to get a little bit tough for Dorothea. Who says to her sister, "Celia," said Dorothea, with emphatic gravity, "pray don't make any more observations of that kind." Okay. Now, this is a tipping point in that conversation because Celia knows, Dorothy has been quite clear, stop saying that. And Celia's thinking, I think what she's thinking is, I still need to know something else. I'm going to have to do one more provocative thing in the hope that you will explain yourself because I know there's something I need to know. So Celia, brave, says, "Why not? They are quite true." And as it says, she had her reasons for persevering, though she was beginning to be a little afraid. Yeah, she's poking. And now Dorothea tries her evasion technique again. Dorothea should stop doing this. "Many things are true which only the commonest minds observe." And patronizing. Oh. And then Celia goes, "Then I think the commonest minds must be rather useful. I think it is a pity Mr. Casaubon's mother had not a commoner mind. She might have taught him better." Okay, this is really trying. And it says Celia was inwardly frightened and ready to run away. Why? Because she knows now. She knows she's pushed well beyond. And yeah. And it says Dorothea's feelings had gathered to an avalanche. In other words, too bad. Snow's coming down now. Hope you're not standing in the way. "It is right to tell you, Celia, that I am engaged to marry Mr. Casaubon. I would love to have... What would that have honestly felt like? We're just reading a fictional story so we can be amused, but something else if it were reality." Perhaps Celia had never turned so pale before. The paper man she was making... Oh, I don't know what to make of that imagery, but I like the fact that she's, this toy that she's making is a paper man. The paper man she was making would have had his leg injured, but for her habitual care of whatever she held in her hands. She laid the fragile figure down at once. It's so, with all this talk about Mr. Casaubon, who we know is elderly and not very well. We just had that list of wonderful medical conditions, which doesn't actually say Casaubon has, but why else? Why else did Eliot list all those, except that we're going to find out just how many of them Casaubon does have. Oh, the poor girl. So she's laid her fragile little paper man down, and she's just sitting perfectly still for a few moments. Oh, when she spoke, there was a tear gathering. "Oh, Dodo, I hope you will be happy." Wow. But it says her fears were the fears of affection. Yeah. Don't think I'll comment on that. Dorothea was still hurt and agitated. Yeah, she hasn't got over the barbs that got poked at her. "Is it quite decided then?" said Celia in an awed undertone. "And Uncle knows." "I have accepted Mr. Casaubon's offer. My uncle brought me the letter that contained it," etc. So there we go. Now Celia knows. It's done. It's dusted, Celia. Don't think you can go down the persuasion route. It's done. So now all Celia is left that she can do is just apologize, right? She did all that poking, throwing all those nasty little comments about Mr. Casaubon and his mother until Dorothea had to say the truth. But doing that, she knows, has hurt Dorothea, and she didn't want to hurt her. She feels already that she's probably going to get hurt enough just by getting married. So she begs her pardon. But, she never could have thought that she should feel as she did. There was something funereal in the whole affair. Yeah, I could just shut this off and go, yeah, look at this. Who, the poor girl, the face that they've captured, there is an even more beautiful, that's a funny word to use for this, but there is another painting of an unequal marriage, which captures that same, it's almost a frozen face of the bride, just frozen because it can't feel, it dare not feel. And it has to wear this beautiful dress and have its hair all beautifully done, but the face is like something that was put in the freezer overnight so that it wouldn't move the next day during the ceremony. So it's something here that, funereal. And Mr. Casaubon seemed to be the officiating clergyman, about whom it would be indecent to make remarks. Yeah. Anyway, Dorothea says nice words. But as we can tell from the last paragraph, that in spite this magnanimity, Dorothea was still smarting, perhaps as much from Celia's subdued astonishment as from her small criticisms. Yeah, so what really has taken Dorothea back is to see Celia just shut down, just so overwhelmed by the the horror of it, that she can't speak. And Dorothea goes on to think, of course, all the world round Tipton would be out of sympathy with this marriage. Dorothea knew of no one who thought as she did, etc., etc. Okay, we go on to page 50. Now, I don't, it's going above and beyond our usual close reading, but I can't see the point of leaving the last 2 pages of this chapter for another meditation, because after 50 and 51, chapter 6 starts, and I couldn't figure out how else to break it up, so we are going to include these. It's actually a page and a half, so this may be a little bit longer, but we'll get to the end of chapter 5. And this is a bit of a clip of what was it like that evening that Mr. Casaubon arrived. If this were any other romance, it would be the most, it would be the point in any book that you would anticipate and look forward to so much. What we get in this scene is something so constrained. I mean, it's an hour. It says, before the evening was at an end, Dorothea was very happy. In an hour's tete-a-tete, so in other words, she had an hour in that evening with Mr. Casaubon. She talked with more freedom than she ever felt before. I actually don't want to read this because a lot of this sounded to me a great deal like what Casaubon had already said in his letter. I think he just sort of said, oh, aren't you a wonderful woman, because you're basically going to give up everything to do what I want. That's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. But of course, the narrator's not impressed. The narrator said down in this little paragraph here, no speech could have been more thoroughly honest in its intention. The frigid rhetoric at the end was as sincere as the bark of a dog or the cawing of an amorous rook. Okay. Would it not be rash to conclude that there was no passion behind those sonnets to Delia, which strike us as the thin music of a mandolin? Now, that's a weird sentence. I have to stop with that one, because let's talk about the sonnets. I'll need to go a little further down in my notes. Bear with me, because I'm going to come back and talk about this love scene. The sonnets to Delia. What on earth is Eliot talking about? Well, I had to look it up, because I had never heard before of Samuel Daniel, who was born in 1562 and died in 1619. So very contemporary, just a little younger than William Shakespeare. Never heard of him. I don't know what that says. The Poetry Foundation website provided me with some of his sonnets, and okay, I'm not crazy about sonnets. I like that they're short, and anyone who's watched my Literary White Whales video will know that I'm intimidated by longer forms of poetry. I'm glad that it's no longer expected of men that they need to compose sonnets as tokens of love. I will read one of Daniel's sonnets. This is not one written to Delia. I read a couple of those, and well, they didn't do anything for me. But you might want to judge for yourself. Go on the Poetry Foundation website, read them, tell me what you think. But this is a sonnet that Daniel wrote in the memory of the late Charles Blount, who was the first Earl of Devonshire. Now, if the Reverend Casaubon were to die in this novel, okay, don't know, wondering, this sonnet could be dedicated to him. This is how it reads. Thou hadst not books as many have for ostentation, but for use, and thy bounteous memory was such as gave a large revenue of the good it got. Witness so many volumes, whereto thou hast set thy notes under thy learned hand, and marked them with that print as will show how the point of thy conceiving thoughts did stand, that none would think, if all thy life had been turned into leisure, thou couldst have attained so much of time to have perused and seen so many volumes that so much contained. Now, I'll leave you to judge, but I believe that Daniel's poem, like Casaubon's letter, could have a blunt version. This is my blunt version of the sonnet. Most of your life was spent reading books and writing in them. And as much as I love books and writing in them, God, I hope people have more to say about me when I'm dead. Now I'm going to go back because I had another comment about this little tete-a-tete between Dorothea and Reverend Casaubon. Because that's it. They just have an hour together. And after that hour, I guess the rest of the evening they spend in company and not particularly seeking anybody else's or seeking to get away from anyone else to spend more time together. Oh, let me just grab that properly. Come on. Dorothea receives a kiss on her candid brow. Very sweet, which made me think again of Celia remarking on, do all old men have a school teacherish view of the young? Well, it's a very school teacherish, very parental sort of kiss on the brow. Again, there's affection here, but it's affection like parent for child rather than lover for lover. I mean, if I could be so bold, because I think comparing Eliot with Austen is bold. Jane Austen and George Eliot, not the same creature, but both good writers, and both are trying to capture love. So let's go to Jane Austen. Two Jane Austen novels that I know best: Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice. Persuasion. And we are going to page 198. And the reason we're doing that is because there is a lovely scene where Anne Elliot, who is the protagonist, she's got back together, she's reconciled with Captain Wentworth. They've already spent a little time walking alone and talking and sort of renewing their affection for each other. And now Captain Wentworth will be attending an event at Anne's father's rented home in Bath. And now I'm reading page 198. This is how the evening goes. And with Captain Wentworth, some moments of communication continually occurring, and always the hope of more, and always the knowledge of his being there. It was in one of these short meetings, each apparently occupied in admiring a fine display of greenhouse plants, that she said, in other words, when there is a real passion between lovers, not only do they want to spend time together, that moment when they are reconciled, when they know they both feel the same, there's almost a hunger to spend time, and that overrides time, or that kind of sneaks around whatever it is they're supposed to be doing with their time. If I also go to Pride and Prejudice, excuse me, I just whacked my desk lamp there. Bear with. Pride and Prejudice. So we're going to chapter 58. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, they set out walking along with Mr. Bingley, Jane, and Kitty, right? And Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy now know how they feel about each other. They know it's time. They can now be frank and admit to their affection. So, of course, this walk begins with 5 people, and then, of course, Mr. Bingley and Jane, who are also in love, they kind of lag behind. And Kitty, who must feel just a little bit uncomfortable, if she has any sense. When they get near the Lucas's home, she says that she wants to go and visit Maria at the Lucas's home. So she departs, and it leaves Elizabeth and Darcy alone to talk about how they feel. And what's the thing that's said? In chapter 59, they finally return back to the Bennet house after this walk. And what's the first thing that Jane says when that chapter opens? She says, "My dear Lizzie, where can you have been walking to?" In other words, you've been gone just a little long, not an hour's tete-a-tete, right? Not an appointment length. This is the time that Mr. Casaubon and Dorothea spend together is like an analyst's appointment. It still has that. It is, isn't it? When two people are in love and they've figured it out and they've both told each other, and now there's all the electricity. It's difficult. It's difficult to pull apart. It's difficult to acknowledge that other things still go on in life, and you have to eat and spend time with other people. It's very difficult. I don't see any. There's no evidence in this prose as this chapter wraps up of that kind of, shivery, I can't see enough of them, I can't, we go walking and time just, there's nothing of that. And it is a sign, it is a portent, that's a good word. Let's go right back down. I'm going to go down to the paragraph that ends this chapter because it made me laugh. It's talked about when they would set the marriage, 6 weeks. Why not? Mr. Casaubon's house was ready. It was not a parsonage, but a considerable mansion, with much land attached to it. The parsonage was inhabited by the curate, who did all the duty except preaching the morning sermon. And I thought, oh, does he? I see. I thought, well, there's a hint of Dorothea's fate, right? Will she end up being like the curate, the one who ends up having to do anything? But then I had an even more wicked thought, which is, this curate who does everything for Casaubon, is he going to have to perform a husband's duty for the Reverend in the way he performs all the other? Because I don't know. I have read a couple of journal articles which suggest Casaubon's impotence. They haven't yet convinced me, but I don't know that they need to. I'm just not sure that this man is interested enough. He may not be impotent, but I'm just not sure that he's interested enough in Dorothea that way, or in that way at all. We're going to see. That is the end of today's Middlemarch meditation. Really loving these. I'm so glad I started this, because this is making the book, going through the book more meaningful to me. The fact that I have to try and make it meaningful for a few minutes to other people. Thanks so much for joining me today, guys. Check out my next one, which you might have to have a few videos in between, but we will get through this book, definitely. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend. All right. Bye-bye.